Cool. Hey,
Howdy.
Charlie.
I have such a cool background. My gosh.
Oh yeah, I came up with that last week.
It's really cool.
Yeah. It, do you do you know how to read the South Indian style of chart?
Um, I get confused on how the houses and signs play in, but I know it starts somewhere.
So it's a fixed sign system, so it's a moving house system.
Okay, so the sign starts, Mars is in Aries right there.
That's right.
Okay,
Yeah, and all the mutable signs around the corners. Anyway,
cool. Right
I've I've
on.
been di- I've been digging it lately. I've been learning this type of Vedic astrology called the Jaimini system that it kind of works really well with.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right on.
Gosh, it's good to see you.
Yeah, likewise.
So, for anyone who, as an introduction to my channel, I guess, I haven't hit, yeah, this is my first video in about a month, I think. Just been deep in study mode. But today I'm talking to my friend Charlie Cross, who's an expert astrologer who I met years ago. We share a lot of similar birth chart things, and we met in a very synchronistic way. And I just realized right before I started this interview that, well, or conversation, is that I just remembered, I think you were the person who introduced me to the concept of Vedic astrology. And certainly
Really?
you were the one, yeah, or maybe I'd heard of it before, but you kind of planted the seed more. And you were definitely the first person that told me that, tropically sun and moon in Capricorn for me would turn into Gemini sidereally. Or no, I'm
Hmm.
sorry, Sagittarius sidereally. And then my ascendant switched from Cancer to Gemini, which,
Hmm.
yeah, was really significant.
Yeah, there was about a year, maybe a year and a half that I was really into the sidereal zodiac. Um, I had this crazy experience. I had this really clear voice in my head one one night during meditation that I needed to use my natural eyes.
Oh,
And one of the clear interpretations of that I took was that I needed to check out the sidereal zodiac. um, I think there's also maybe stuff there actually for me still to explore around, I wear contacts and use glasses, and I don't know, it was one of these like deep, poetic communiques, but yeah, for a while there, I was actually sort of afraid, that like the sidereal zodiac was the real zodiac. And
yeah.
and I like needed to figure out that mystery. But no, I mean, I saw myself very clearly through it, and I still do. Um, yeah, and there was a good spell there that was my main that I was basically reading through the sidereal zodiac. I didn't have any like full training in Vedic astrology, or so I was kind of, whipping up what I could from my self study. But
Yeah, well,
yeah,
there's a lot of people out there who like the sidereal zodiac, who are doing it from a Western astrology approach as
yeah,
well.
totally. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the best information on the history of the zodiac, I guess, came from Kenneth Bowser and Cyril Fagan. Like the Western sidereal astrologers were very did some really good research. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think I heard an interview with someone who was on the astrology podcast who was a part of that lineage.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it didn't have the best vibe, that interaction. It didn't, yeah,
There can,
it was,
yeah, it's a strange dog to, hunt. Is that a phrase? It's strange dog to have in a fight. Like the
yeah.
sidereal zodiac is the true zodiac.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, there's so many. It seems like all the biggest fiascos I've heard about in the astrology world have been almost all been around people with really strong opinions around that, kind of making an
Yeah.
ass of themselves or something.
Yeah,
Like,
there was another one from the other perspective, at a pre like this big Western astrologer went to a conference in India
That's the one I'm
said,
thinking of. Yeah.
yeah, what a fucking dick.
Yeah. Seriously.
Shows up to India, tells them all that they've been using the wrong zodiac for,
Yeah. There's a
yeah,
really great episode of the Astrology podcast, though, where the guy who hosts that podcast breaks down like all the flaws with that person's argument, which is
yeah,
interesting because he actually prefers tropical himself.
sure. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so
Go
my latest revelation around this that I shared with you this week through text, we haven't gotten to talk about it yet, is that because I had a big shift in my perspective this past week, where because of these J-mini techniques I've been learning, they just seem to really make more sense tropically, and then it makes sense to me because it's not based on any nakshatras. It's not it's based way more around the sun than the moon, and basically, and like the timing techniques, the dasha systems of Jaimini all use they're sign based, they're not nakshatra based. Mm-hmm. So for example, so that's kind of like was a clue, but also they're more based the way that Ernst Wilhelm describes it all. He says that like the Jaimini system is more based in the real relationships between the planets as they actually apply in someone's life on a physical level, whereas the sidereal astrology or the Parashara, which is the more common Indian astrology, that it's more based on the way someone is the planets are affecting someone psychologically, basically.
Interesting.
So I came to my own conclusion based on that like, well, why does the sidereal always feel like so much more accurate to me when I'm looking at the nakshatras? And I think that's the answer, is because the nakshatras are based around the moon, which is having to do with your subjective perception and your emotions. Whereas this Jaimini system is kind of brutal, honestly, in how accurate it feels around physical realities of things.
Wow. That's so interesting, because that's actually sort of the inverse of the way that one of my teachers described how he uses both systems.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so Moses Sirigar the third he's an astrolocation expert. Okay. And yeah, is well-versed in both, Western and Vedic astrology, and sort of toggles between both systems. Like, he's one of these guys that just opens the floodgates in terms of techniques, like just, looks at everything. And
that's awesome. Yeah.
I
like that.
When he's people are coming to him to like see if they want to move somewhere, and so he tries his best to like cover all the bases of, okay, this planet is in dignity in this system, but not in this system, so forth. And yeah. And
oh, wow. Right.
So yeah, it's a pretty intensive process that he uses to calculate that. But yeah, when he explained to me that just the basic simple model that he uses for both of those, for the two zodiacs, he said that he thinks about the sidereal zodiac as actually being a little bit more literally, concretely true. Yeah. Like, we're talking about the chart of a buddy of mine who has a Taurus ascendant tropically and an Aries ascendant sidereally. And the Aries ascendant sidereally checks out super cool, like super, super clearly. He's just this buff, like wild man,
right,
who has some sort of like ridiculous natural talent for just being a physical incarnated. He's also got the exalted Mars and the 10th house and so, but yeah. And then the converse, he was talking about how the tropical zodiac is measured from the inside out, and therefore is more psychologically attuned or what have you. It's like it's the inside of the earth, basically. It's like a three-dimensional sacred geometrical structure. You can think about the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn as describing places in space around the Earth's equator, or the Earth's latitudinal structure.
Right. Yeah. So that makes it more subjective in his view.
In his view, yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, that's pretty much the way I was looking at it before, this past week, before learning the Gemini system and applying those techniques both ways. And because I was viewing it as the stars are going to be more objective because they're way further out there. So if we're basing the signs around the positions of the actual constellations, more so than around the changing of the seasons, which is more a human subjective experience, so that is the way I was viewing it pretty much exactly until a week ago. But it's so interesting. So I met somebody new recently who was very feminine in a very traditional kind of way, but in sidereally, they had like a double or triple signs in Cancer. But then tropically, they're in Leo. And they also have this confidence that's kind of, and they can hold their own space. I feel like there's something about the yin yang relationship that just tends to get oversimplified, where, this is yin, where in reality, it's always like two ways you can look at the same thing.
I mean, this even brings us to this question around, does the sun necessarily represent the yang energy and the moon necessarily the yin energy?
Wow, I haven't even entertained that yet, but that's exactly the direction this logic would head. I've never even thought of that or heard of that. What's your take on that?
Olivia, my colleague Olivia Pepper,
of course,
has this experience of the sun and the moon as switching genders at regular intervals.
Whoa. Okay, so my first question is that related to the moon cycle of new moon, full moon?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Olivia talks about this. I might have to pull it up again, but Olivia has this really strong perception of the planets as sort of like characters or beings.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. A year ago, I really, took off with my studies and practicing of astrology after taking your class with Olivia on Mercury.
Yeah.
During Mercury Retrograde, and here we are a year later on Mercury Retrograde.
Yeah. So, I mean, Mercury is like a clear character that Olivia has like a very interesting perception of as being basically like a, pretty queer, gender fluid force, which makes sense for Mercury, whose being is oriented towards sort of crossing boundaries and being at the middle point between opposites and so forth, and sort of even overturning or playing with norms or standards. But yeah, the sun and the moon, I think Olivia said something like in the summer, they experience the sun as like a Black woman.
Whoa.
And they especially experience the moon as sort of like the whitest of the planets.
Whoa, interesting.
Yeah, I have a whole recording of Olivia riffing on this, but it was a very interesting perception and something that I actually have had echo in my own experience. Like when I've done ritual with the sun, especially, like, oh yeah, I kind of experienced the sun as there's a face that I've experienced of the sun as a feminine, a strong feminine force. But yeah, and I mean, but think about this also, like female lions are like super badass, they're in some way, male lions are just like sitting around looking pretty, and it's the female lions that are like actually doing the badass stuff. But yeah, I mean, there's a way in which, and even within the yin yang structure, they merge, they blend with each other. And so, yeah, and this is, I mean, it's a shame And it's strange, because there's such strong internal logic to so many astrological systems. But I think that at some point, you can't necessarily try to find like a meta theory of all astrology. Like it's mostly either applying one set of systems or traditional techniques in a pretty like logically sequential structure, or it's working with many of them in mostly an artistic, intuitive manner. Like you can't really try to,
yeah. So I mean, yeah, totally. And that was the thing that Olivia said in that that class I took from the two of you a year ago that really inspired me. And you said that you heard a lecture or something from somebody that was kind of similar that inspired you years ago, where she was saying that she called it star poetry, where it's sort of this, so it can be an individual's, just intuited way of interpreting the stars, or so to speak. And even Ernst Wilhelm kind of talks about it this way. And he's like a Wikipedia. I mean, he's the one I'm kind of deep in studying right now. And he's like a Wikipedia of everybody's perspective traditionally.
He's the scholar of that.
Yeah. And yet at the same time, he's very like, he holds the opinion and says it quite often that, you don't need to know that much to really make an accurate prediction if you're just coming from an intuitive place, that these techniques are just tools to kind of help you with that, to have less effort involved. But if a message needs to be seen, it will be seen one way or another.
Yeah. And this is something that so many different people have talked about. Even, Adam, I guess he's Achyuta Bhava Dasa, formerly Adam Allenboss, or at least when I was studying with him, didn't use the outer planets.
Right.
And he would only use the 7 traditional planets in a Western context.
Did he use the nodes? Just curious.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay.
But he would talk about how astrology is sort of fractal, in that whatever needs to be shown or whatever needs to be talked about or will reveal itself in multiple different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what I've heard from different Vedic astrologers. The consensus seems to be about the outer planets that they're just kind of echoing the message of Rahu and Ketu mostly, as well as, I forget which are considered related. I know Venus is related to Neptune. Mars, is that related to Uranus or Pluto or both?
Pluto, yeah.
Pluto, and then it's Mercury to Uranus, right? Yeah. So I mean, all these things being exactly. So yeah.
I don't know if that's always necessarily checked out in my own experience.
Right. It couldn't be totally, because they're going to be in different places.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And also, I mean, I sometimes use the asteroid goddesses. I don't use a ton of, there's thousands of asteroids. I don't use a lot of asteroids, just the 4 major ones. And oftentimes there's a sort of voice there that I don't always hear from the rest of the chart. So for example, like, if one of the asteroid goddesses is on a strong angle, or conjunct the sun or moon,
and could you just say what the 4 are?
Yeah, so that's Vesta, Pallas Athena, Juno, and Ceres.
That's Pallas Athena is one name or 2?
Yeah, Pallas Athena is one name. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I've always seen it just as Pallas. I didn't know Athena was.
Pallas. Yeah, I think maybe. I'm not exactly sure of the history of the name and of the naming of the asteroid, but yeah, sometimes there's a voice there that comes through that I don't have through other parts of the chart.
And what are the basic significances of those 4 goddess asteroids?
Well, they're different sort of faces or forms of the feminine, we could say.
Okay.
Olivia and I did a class on them this spring. Really beautiful experience. We could speak about them forming a sort of mandala of the feminine experience. They even fit into to the structure of a chart pretty well, where Vesta could be on the ascendant, describing a sort of independence, sort of self-ownership. The Vestal virgins were like the only people in the ancient world the only woman that could be without a partner, that they could be not married. Oh, shoot. Yeah, Pallas Athena represents a sort of feminine warrior type quality to the
right. Athena, the goddess of war or something like that.
Maybe a sort of leadership as well. We could think about her at the midheaven.
Okay.
Yeah, Juno, of course, is the seventh, like that, the descendant, seventh house.
Okay.
Goddess of partnership. Yeah, and Ceres at the IC, describing our relationship to the earth, and yeah, the depths of sort of ancestral awareness and the mysteries and magic of the earth. Yeah, it's interesting though, and I think the asteroid goddesses are a very good realm to see how, or to be a sort of description of star poetry, especially insofar as we can see the mythology or significations or the poetry of those planets being connected with a historical circumstance. So those are very clearly Greco-Roman beings that have sort of traces of older goddess cults.
Right.
And we can see like this, we can see a pretty strong like patriarchal stamp on them.
It's interesting because just prior to this recording, I was trying to catch up, just watch a few videos on Rahu because it's such a Rahu day, like I told you. I bit into a hot pepper and nearly died like 2 hours ago. And seriously, it was the most painful hot pepper experience I've ever had in my life.
Oh my gosh.
It was insane. And I like hot food, so it was so weird. But I wound up watching some video because it was some website said, okay, for a Rahu, to puja for Rahu, some kind of like devotional ritual for Rahu, you would want to deal with like one of the, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the goddess, but there was like 9 goddesses that she incarnated as, that include most of the most famous Indian ones like Pavarti and Kali, and so I was watching this video on the 9 goddesses. So it's very and they were all basically descended from this warrior goddess to fight evil. Wow. the evil of Rahu's chaos, basically. So it's very interesting you're bringing this up. Maybe. And it wasn't all Athena energy. It was pretty much the same thing you're describing with these asteroids, except divided into 9 instead of 4. Yeah. So,
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the ways that Olivia and I are trying to sort of recontextualize astrology is in much more of the, artistic approach to astrology, rather than the necessarily like rules-based. Like trying to calculate destiny or what have you. I mean, I think this is inherent within these traditions. Like if you look at the origin of astrology is part of the 3 Hermetic arts, the 3 royal arts taught by Hermes Trismegistus: alchemy, astrology, and theurgy. And so theurgy, magic, the invocation
Oh
of
yeah, yeah, right, right.
deities and so forth. And so there's a clear way in which astrology is a part of the context of other activities which have to do with spiritual development and relationship with beings and the cosmos and magic and so forth. And that's present within Vedic astrology too. Like, if you go to an astrologer that's practicing Vedic astrology, they're not just going to tell you what's going to happen or not. I mean, maybe they would give hard and fast delineations or predictions if you ask for it, or if you or you're going for like a compatibility assessment or something of the sort. But most of the time, they're going to give you remediation prescriptions, like ways to try to fix difficult circumstances, pujas and stones to wear, or, kind of weird rituals or mantras to do, or what have you. And so there's a way in which astrology as a tradition, we have this cultural legacy of astrology being like a, spooky, deterministic model of calculating fate. But no, it's actually very much a part of traditions and lineages of sort of working with destiny or what have you, or working with the psyche or soul or spirit or these different beings, to work through things.
I can't so that is the question of like the free will versus determinism, and how much is astrology just telling people, because there's certain placements that are just, exalted or debilitated, or it's on your first house, or it's in your 12th or 8th house. And those are going to have very different manifestations. And then as well as transits and, these other timing methods of dashas. But then, this idea of remedial practices, I don't know. To me, it's an open question still, because I just don't know. I mean, I find meditation and spiritual practice in general very effective. And I think these remedial measures, a lot of it seems to be a targeted version of that. So if somebody's very angry, rather than just meditate or surrender to God or do some other like kind of basic practice, maybe they do some kind of meditation on Mars, or, to appease Mars, which is really just, the way I see it, like a metaphorical aspect of one's own psyche, and that part of it, that kind of the shadow of Yang energy, if it was an out of control, angry Mars that was being destructive, or, or something like that. Or maybe I guess any of these planets have their positive and negative potentials that are reflections of our own psyches. I mean, and maybe the word psyche, I don't just mean psychological either. I mean, like energetically. I mean, I'm very drawn. I'm very drawn to Vedic astrology, but some of these deeper questions of free will versus determinism that go all the way back to the ancient texts, because people were always doing like different rituals, including animal sacrifices that people would not want to do today. So I mean, and I wouldn't want people to. So I mean, I also think there's this evolution of things happening, and we're always in the moment. I mean, to me, star poetry is you deciding for yourself, and Olivia deciding for themselves, and me. And it could change year to year, month to month. Like last month, I was exclusively practicing sidereal. Now I'm doing a combination where I would still use sidereal for nakshatras, which I find a very insightful lens. But then right now I'm blown away by the application of these techniques tropically. So yeah, I'm not denying that those things have merit. And you told me about an amazing story of somebody doing a ritual involving the water dragon god of Uttara Bhadrapada, to combat, what was it? Some kind of fire or something, right?
Yeah, it was a really intense forest fire. This is Gordon White. The story is documented in his recent book, Animistic. but yeah, dude invoked this water dragon, and he did it sort of like
I think it's pronounced Abhid Niwar. Gosh, Abhid Niwar, I believe, is the dragon. Yeah, I think. I could be wrong. But I think that's okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
But yeah, I mean, and he did it using this sort of like blend of tropical and sidereal, different systems. I'm not exactly sure what the sequence was, but so he's really close with Austin Coppock, who is a great practitioner and scholar of the decans and of astrology and magic in general, and also a student of Freedom Cole. So Austin has this capacity to sort of step between the two systems, trained in both Vedic and tropical astrology, like a deep student of both traditions.
Yeah.
And they were like, okay, this is a desperate situation. We got to call in some like big water guns, and I think that they were.
It would have been like tropically in Aries, so there was a fire element, so he had to go back to the sidereal for the water dragon.
I think what it sort of was is that they were looking for a time when the moon was going to be in a water sign.
Okay.
And the next time that was going to happen was sort of too far out tropically.
Right. It would have been another 3 days because it's 2.5 days for the moon to change signs. So
something of the sort. Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah.
But so they did the ritual according to the lunar mansion, the sidereal lunar mansion. And then they knew while they were doing the ritual that it would happen actually at that time in the tropical system. So they were waiting for the moon to get into Pisces, I think. And I'm not exactly sure I'll have to go back and reread it, but basically it's sort of what actually concretely happened is they did the ritual with the sidereal circumstance, and then it played out according to the tropical circumstance.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it works. Like he talked about being able to see the visage of the water dragon in the clouds. I
believe it. I mean, I feel like someone like Carl Jung, like his work is often misunderstood as like being just psychologically reductive in some way or just mystical, when really it's pointing in this direction of both to me. And which, like, you're just like for the star poetry to really sing, you have to have like a certain basis of like knowledge of the basics or what other people have thought and has worked for them in the past. I feel like you need that interplay of the left and right brain, the yin and the yang flowing into each other. Like, is sort of what I'm saying. Because I mean, that's the way it feels to me when you talk about these things, is like someone really trusting their intuition who also has a lot of knowledge and experience. I mean, otherwise you don't need the knowledge and experience. You don't even need astrology. You could just, be a magician, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what I'm getting at there.
Yeah, I mean, there's this maybe question of like, do we need astrology or what have you?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we do. I think it's just a beautiful color of reality to look through or look at.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's medicinal for this part of ourselves that is stuck in a disenchanted world. The systems that we live in.
Right. Yeah.
Cold, quote unquote, cold, hard reality. Astrology can, very quickly open you up to the enchantment of reality very quickly. And that within itself is nourishing to the soul, I think.
You're absolutely right. I mean, that's a very beautiful way of putting it. I guess, I'm just repeating the same things that you mean by star poetry, but just coming from like my musician background, I like this analogy comes to me of like it's like what Miles Davis or different people said about jazz, where you have to like learn all the right ways to play before you can like do whatever you want.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the way that
And not
Olivia's
right. And I misspoke by calling it the right way. I just mean learn like traditional styles and do that well to a degree. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like, so Olivia talks about astrology being like different forms of poetry, you know, and so there's all these different structures for poetry, these different traditions, you know, the ecstatic Sufi tradition, or Shakespearean sonnets, or what have you. And yeah, some people have that sort of natural affinity for different fits. Like you've just taken to Vedic astrology like a, you know,
yeah,
I don't know what the metaphor or the poetic metaphor is.
I felt very, it resonated for me in a specific way. And it was the same, but it was the same way with me in like non-duality, where even when I found out about all these modern teachers, you know, I was never too drawn to like Eckhart Tolle, or there's some other people out there that people might be familiar with named Rupert Spira, even Muji, like who's more British and sort of, but of Caribbean descent, I think. But yeah, but I mean, once I found like Ramana Maharshi or Neem Karoli Baba, it's just something about it clicked for me. And it almost makes me think, oh, maybe that's a past life thing, but who knows? It's just like an energy. You know, we click with certain people, we click with certain styles, and others we don't as much, you know?
But nobody's going to tell you that that's like the wrong path, you know?
Right.
Or if they do, they are wrong, you know? And so there's not like this standard of judging or of assessing astrology. It's basically like, I mean, like, yes, I guess there's slam poetry competitions, you know, but like that's just a sort of
like a competition, like a roast.
It's just a game, you know.
Yeah,
it's
right.
Yeah. And so with astrology, I mean, there are real-term consequences in the sense that people have these perceptions or preconceptions about astrology. You know, if somebody says something really concrete to somebody, if an astrologer says something concrete, predictive, harsh to a client, that has real soul consequences for sure. And that's why there's value in, you know, professional certifications, or, you know, the professionalization of astrology. But at the end of the day, if you are, how do I want to phrase this? Especially when we get to the point where we're aware of multiple different systems of astrology, there's no standards of judgment for one being better than the other. It's all a matter of resonance, of who feels attracted to different things. Even for the case of like different astrologers, like people that come to me, for the most part, 75% of it, I feel like we've just got some natural affinity, that there's some guidance that's arranging our interaction. This has even been documented by like some of the people that are doing sort of medical astrology research, that somebody's going to get way better results from a doctor that has like their sons, when their sons trine each other or something. Like there's something sort of at a more fundamental level, that's some chemistry that's happening, that's not connected necessarily with different techniques, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why for me, like, I mean, Carl Jung used astrology in his practice, but he wasn't known as an astrologer too much. He just, it was something he might have just been an amateur at, for all I know, but he used it and he said it helped him. But with his clients, that he said he never did looked at a new case without looking at their chart first.
Sure.
Even if he just glanced at it, maybe. But but I think his two concepts of synchronicity and archetypes kind of sum up like 90% of astrology to me, because
I
everything
mean,
you're describing is a synchronicity involving archetypes, basically. The sun matching up. That's a synchronicity with the archetype of the sun.
mhm.
That's beautiful. And reality is full of like synchronicities. I think that's kind of the amazing thing about spiritual experiences or psychedelic experiences, is that all of a sudden they just kind of open you up to this reality of like, wow, everything's connected in a way that I didn't realize before. And I guess astrology is just another way to kind of somewhat objectify that even. That's really trippy when it feels dead on.
Well, on some level, we can speak about astrology as a language. You know, the word astrologos,
Right.
star speak. I mean, it also can have a connotation of star logic or star law, but star word, you know, in the beginning
Right.
was the logos, you know. Yeah, and so this is something that we can emphasize as a part of the astrological community, that this is a way for us to speak the language of the soul, language of the stars, to cut through to a deeper level of conversation with friends, with clients, to yeah, it's a symbolic language that allows us to connect with these sort of primordial forces. And those primordial forces don't, even though there's a sort of mathematical structure for how they can be sort of understood, there's no, like, there, it's not going to be scientifically like mapped out or analyzed in the same way that we can do that around, you know, certain mechanical structures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I simply don't think the soul is mechanical. Even if we can be, you know, even if there's an incredible amount of accuracy of the type of statements that we can make about somebody's personality or what have you using astrology, all those still have a lot of wiggle room. And there's still a lot of different realms of possibility of how they can be expressed through different points in time. There's still a lot of space, even though there might be a lot of straight lines or a lot of you know, descriptions that have hard edges or boundaries or what have you. There's still immense freedom within those structures.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess the Vedic perspective, maybe it's Parashara that wrote this down, but there was something about, I heard from Ernst Wilhelm, there was something about how 75, mathematically, one of the ancient Vedic texts says 75% is predetermined of what is happening or going to happen. And it said 25% is accessible by fully being yourself and embracing your soul's purpose and whatnot. But it said that if you access, but then it had this interesting asterisk kind of thing, you know, annotation to that, where it said if you fully access the 25% that you can do with your free will by being fully alive, fully, you know, embracing what you want to do, that you can do, then it says that God will fulfill another 75%, which will like outweigh. So it'll be 100% versus this predetermined 75% is the math.
Damn.
Like, yeah, which is such a beautifully poetic way of kind of describing the realm of possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it also reminds me of, there's this whole like archetype of like did you see that movie Whiplash?
Mm-mm.
Or it's also in Fight Club, I guess, where like, you remember in Fight Club how like when people are trying to join Project Mayhem, and then the person says like, no, you're not allowed or whatever. Brad Pitt's like, no, you're not cool enough to be one of us. Like, you suck. And then the person just sits there anyway and waits. It's like, on some level, the predetermined aspects, I think, can actually create something really beautiful in the same way that, or the apparently predetermined aspects, because it's also all up to interpretation to a degree. And I guess what I'm getting at is like, I was looking at someone's chart last week, or yeah, that was like, where there was just so much like debilitated, there was like 2 debilitated planets, and there was like only one planet that was even in like a friend sign. It just looked so bleak, but I like was kind of reading into this person's story, and they were so smart and just like had all these great qualities and things they were involved in. And then I just realized, oh, well, like these are all the challenges that you kind of came up with, that you're just all that are there for you. And that actually but the way that that person responds to that in that case was like, well, these are challenges that I want to get better at, or I want to overcome. Whereas somebody who might have an exalted Venus or Jupiter and all these things that don't have as much challenge in certain areas, that just sort of like take it for granted and be like, oh,
sometimes
yeah,
it's an image of decadence even. Yeah.
Exactly. And it can sort of like on a soul level make the person asleep. Whereas this person was very spiritually like awake and active and seeking and part of groups and doing different things in that realm, where, you know, yeah, if they were born into a life of decadence and had no incentive otherwise, I mean, nothing, why would they like pursue astrology or anything? Yeah. So
yeah, man. And I mean, this is a description of where the language of dignity and detriment actually, I don't know if it's entirely appropriate for our day and age. You know, it definitely encodes sometimes a normative image of, say, femininity, you know, or masculinity, or what it means to have a good or bad expression of a certain archetype. Whereas I think a lot of the magic of what's happening today is the overturning of these expectations or what have you. It's more of a, I mean, so like there's so much beautiful transgression, I would call it. And beautiful innovation of expression that's happening from, like, some of the people with Venus and Scorpio that I know are the hottest and have like the most amazing romantic or social experiences I know, you know. And sometimes people with Venus and Taurus have fucking boring lives. Like, it's just they figure out the 3 meals that they like and the 3 people that they like, and they stick to it, you know. There's something like that.
Yeah. No, go on.
Yeah. And so in some way, like this gestures in the direction of star poetry.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, actually, but I guess what I was going to say about it is like the star poetry. I mean, well, yeah, I mean, about those 2 examples you just mentioned, though. I mean, Venus and Taurus, I've heard this sort of thing described as like, especially in terms of the nakshatras of like Rohini at the center of Taurus, as opposed to maybe a Venus and Scorpio, which would be in Jayestha sidereally, could be in Jayestha. Like, because to me, Rohini and Jayestha are kind of the most archetypally attached to their sign nakshatras of Taurus and Scorpio. And so, like, traditionally, I mean, Rohini is the goddess of beauty and all this kind of stuff, more or less. And yeah, I heard this amazing description of it through Claire, this channel I told you about. Claire Nocti did her own analysis of people who were, I guess, super wealthy or whatever. And this thing that she discovered was that through her research of real cases of people, was that people born with Taurus placements were far less likely to be very wealthy or be seeking out beauty, and they'd be more just kind of like satisfied with whatever. And more like appreciative of what's around, which is something I've also noticed about Venus and Pisces, where it's like someone could just find like
go with the flow.
Go with the flow. Yeah, and almost feel like an orgasmic kind of experience just from being outside and breathing in the fresh air, whereas someone who might be more debilitated is going to seek really hard and want to accumulate wealth and sex and all these things. And there's nothing wrong with that either. It's like these beautiful different expressions, but like but what you're saying about star poetry, it's like that could go away from the realm of dignity, or because that's one way. It reminds me of like, it's like Dylan going electric, or music turning into electronic when it used to be live music mostly in popular music. And that's one direction to keep things lively and interesting and current. But another direction is to just kind of if you feel so inspired to like go into the traditional and like what the White Stripes did in the early 2000s, or there's this great Norwegian band called Black Midi that just sort of reinvented, you know, like guitar based drum music just this past few years. And so there's always ways to do it, but it's not easy.
Yeah. And I mean, we're seeing a huge revival of traditional techniques.
Well, yeah,
like
right.
Brennan's Hellenistic Project Hindsight. Yeah, there's a lot going on there. Yeah, I mean, and
wait, but just real quick, when you say a revival, but do you mean there's a revival of trying to do it very analytically, perfectly the way these old books say, or is it, well, let's take this information in and let's try to integrate that with what we've learned the last 100 years, or do it I mean, that's where it gets a little tricky, right? When you go back to the ancient, and it's okay to do that too, I guess, but with what you're saying about star poetry, like if you're embracing the Hellenistic and the ancient, do you see people doing that, or do you see a way of doing that that also includes a poetic license to have your interpretation? Or are those sort of like diametrically opposite things?
Yeah. Definitely not diametrically opposite. Yeah. But I think that involves a more nuanced understanding of what was going on in those traditions. So for example, in Hellenistic astrology, there's the lot of fortune and the lot of spirit. And the lot of fortune describes more typically deterministic, you know, concrete allotment of fate or allotment of fortune. A lot of spirit actually has to do with more your spiritual development and your development of your will and the unfolding of your will. And so there is a language within that tradition also of freedom.
Where's the freedom in those lots of fortune?
A lot of spirit. A lot of spirit is especially about sort of out of our own will impulses, what we make, what we do with our, what have you. I would say that the traditional revival has also given us new language for star poetry, in the sense that some of the words that they use to describe some of the things that are unfolding are very graphic.
Yeah.
And
what do you mean by that? I think I know what you mean, but what do you mean by graphic?
Okay, so like for example, so I'm not really fully trained in Hellenistic astrology or what have you. I mostly just have read, but for example, in in maybe some of the more psychologically oriented terms of the astrology that developed over the last 100 some years, you could describe planets being in difficult signs, or maybe having an aspect of a square to Mars or Saturn or whatever. And you could talk about the malefic planets or what have you.
Yeah.
And now there's also language of things like besiegement, which is being, I'm not exactly sure what that directly relates to, yeah, or even the unfolding of the lots of the way that different planetary placement or zodiacal releasing, for example, the way that different planets sort of unfold in their development or what have you. So there's actually a sort of richer spectrum of language, I would say, that we've learned through new translations of old texts. I'd also say that sometimes it's helpful to people to know when things would be traditionally difficult. So it can be healing to hear, hey, this is, according to tradition, a difficult placement. That's awesome to hear for some people. If they're really struggling with that, that's helpful to hear.
Right. It acknowledges a reality.
I never present that in such a way that it's they're doomed. But and I think that those placements can be really meaningful. but it can be helpful to hear. I would say that that's also especially true insofar as I have followed through with medical astrology, for example, in understanding the function of different planets and their capacity to fulfill that function from different in different placements. So for example, both of us have the moon in Capricorn, tropically. And that would describe the lunar emphasis being maybe a little under-resourced or what have you.
I've also got like a new moon like birth chart. So
me too. Yeah.
Oh,
and
wow.
so there's ways of speaking that can be helpful to hear, and so there is this quote unquote deterministic model or what have you actually sometimes just can help us have a palette that has a broader range of colors, that it's not just it's all good, it's not just all airy fairy light and nice, that there's actually a contrast that we can add in, that there's a spectrum of gifts and also difficulty, and that creates a richer drama, a richer emotional, the whole spectrum, rather than, I think some of the new age approaches to astrology kind of shut out the shadow, that they just exclusively focus on the light.
I've heard that. That's all really interesting. And I agree with pretty much everything you're saying. I feel like we should, maybe address, just for fun, it feels like talking a little bit about the Mercury in retrograde right now, and also today happens to be this, moon in Ardra day, which is ruled by Rahu, and there's another Rahu element today. So those are two things I'd like to just maybe look at for a moment, just our perspectives on those.
Sure, let me pull up the chart of the moment.
Mercury's in, and we can look at it tropically.
Sure.
For the retrograde is in Libra, right? With Mercury.
Yeah, tropically.
Yeah, which is a really interesting contrast. If we did look at it sidereally, then that's an exalted Mercury. So it is a very interesting way. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing to consider. But what's your take about the retrograde right now? And we're also at the cusp of the change into the next season, right?
Yeah, and that's actually interesting. The midpoint of the retrograde, the cazimi between Mercury and the Sun, is happening on the solstice, and that's really so that's a striking moment.
Or the equinox.
Excuse me, the equinox. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, what's my take on it? One thing that I think is interesting about it is that you can follow Mercury's retrogrades through the elements. And so for every year and a half, Mercury will be retrograding in a particular element. And so during that time, Mercury will spend as much time in that element as they do in the rest of the other three elements. And so for the last year and a half, we've been in air signs.
Okay.
And we're actually transitioning into earth signs. And so this coming retrograde, not this one's retrograding. It's the transition point. It's the retrograde from the air sign back into the earth sign. And the next one will occur entirely in Capricorn, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And this is tropical.
Yeah.
Most of what I do is tropical these days.
We could stick with tropical. We don't have to. Yeah. For this.
Yeah. But yeah, that's interesting to me, because I think it's already happening that we're having this really strong awareness over materiality, which I think, and really big changes in our relationship to the earth, to resources, very clearly described by the Uranus North Node conjunction happening in Taurus. But I think it's actually going to continue and deepen over the next year and a half or so when we have Mercury running through the, retrograding through the Earth signs. Yeah, we might have a good deal of pretty significant changes with regards to materiality.
So Mercury retrograde, the main way I'm interpreting it at the moment is related to, like, I mean, things tend to, like, communication troubles, technology problems, or things in general, like mechanically, that just go wrong. But the ultimate kind of, it's a little mischievous, but it's more just trying to get you to look at something that needs to be looked at, that needs to be, have kinks worked out. Like, that's sort of the way that I usually I've been feeling it lately.
Sure, yeah.
It feels like it lines up with what you're saying about when we go into the Earth signs the next couple years, because you're saying we're going to need to look at things materially in a new way. That there's going to, that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah. So I would say that's a process that's starting to unfold that will continue. Yeah. And there's maybe mediation between relationships and materiality that's occurring right now.
Because of the Libra.
Yeah, from Libra into Virgo. Yeah.
So relationships are being re-examined right now because of the Mercury retrograde from Libra into Virgo.
Yeah. How we navigate relationships. I mean, we could also speak about Mercury here, especially the opposition to Jupiter is quite striking. Long opposition with Jupiter, between Mercury and Jupiter. I've sort of imagined this as a sort of conversation between a teacher and a student.
Yeah.
I mean, I've also been in the hardcore learning phase of just biting off so much information.
Wow, you and me both.
Yeah, intensively. And in some way, we also can think about Mercury here as a sort of trickster, questioning, figure, especially concerned with relationality. Maybe interrogating or prodding at that Jupiter in Aries. So poking at them. That Jupiter in Aries is pretty strong, pretty confident, pretty high and mighty. And so how does that Mercury, is Mercury popping holes in that Jupiter? Is Mercury like maybe taking some of the heat out of Jupiter's head? Yeah. And I mean, the really strong thing also was the trine from Mercury to Mars and the sextile with Jupiter and Mars. There was this long way that Mars was mediating between the two. Of course, Mars in Mercury's sign, Jupiter in Mars's sign. Yes, there was a nice mediation. Yeah. I mean, gosh,
those are incredible insights. That's really great. I think anybody who sees this close to when it comes out will appreciate it. And so today in particular, like Moon in Rahu, which happens once every 27 days. So it's not that of a rare occurrence. Slightly more rare that there would be a second element of the Indian timing model of Panchanga that includes the day of the week, the phase of the moon, and a couple other things. So, like, there's this double Rahu energy in the Rahu ruled sign of Ardra sidereally right now, and the last video I uploaded before this one was actually about Gemini, and Ardra is right smack in the middle of Gemini, and it's symbolized by a storm. And which gave me this really incredible insight into Gemini the more that I looked at it, because it's like Gemini has this storm-like energy. It's like tornadoes. Like it's not like a it's not like necessarily a polite, cordial way of like exchanging ideas. It's kind of just like all over the place. Like it could be cordial, it could be aggressive, it could be passive aggressive, it could be overly analytical. It's just kind of everything's brought to the table to be looked at and then start to be unraveled. And then at the end of Gemini sidereally, you have the nakshatra Punarvasu, where this does actually get worked out, or it sort of gets abandoned and tabled for later, and you just sort of like bliss out in the cosmos for a little bit. Like that's kind of the energy of Punarvasu, and then it gets maybe re-examined when you later in the zodiac when you get to Virgo or something. But yeah, I don't know. I mean,
do you have this? Is this your ascendant nakshatra too?
No, it's close. Mine is Punarvasu. I have Rahu in Ardra, and I've heard a couple of Vedic astrologers actually say that Rahu is exalted in Gemini and it's exalted in Ardra because that's where it would kind of have the most fun and just go crazy. Like be at the center of the storm. There's nowhere that Rahu would rather be.
Sure.
Like Rahu ultimately is here to help us make positive change, but it's all about embracing the chaos to get there. Like it wants that chaos. So like the hot pepper I had that wound up making me think, oh gosh, do I even need to eat these tacos? Like why don't I eat some watermelon and actually soothe my throat instead of constantly overstimulating it with like spicy food? So it was like this really aggressive message that ultimately may lead me to like healthier diet choices in the next week.
Sure.
So that's in a nutshell how I view Rahu from a positive direction. And yeah, and Rahu is in Western astrology is just referred to as the North Node, although maybe not with the same implications. And so, yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
Gosh, well, yeah, there is a tradition of calling the North or the North Node the head of the dragon.
Oh yeah. I have heard that. Yeah.
Kaput. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's a serpent relationship to the story of Rahu. Traditionally, yeah, the mythology of it.
Astrology, yeah.
Yeah, it's actually like it was someone who wasn't a god that drank some nectar that he wasn't supposed to drink, and so Vishnu like killed him and chopped his head off. But right after he drank the nectar of immortality, so his head lives on forever, but without the body. And then I guess elsewhere it's described that his head gets attached to the body of a snake, and then his body gets attached to a head of a snake, and then that's Ketu. And they're on opposite sides of the zodiac, the north and south node.
Yep.
Yeah.
What do I want to say about this? Well,
but what does that mean? The north, or like the head of the dragon in Western astrology, does that mean the same thing? Does it mean the way I was describing it, a sort of chaotic force designed to spur on evolution, but in a pretty abrupt way? Or does it mean something else?
I actually couldn't tell you the history of the mythology around the North Node in the Western canon.
Well, in the way that you apply it, then, or the way you would interpret a rock.
Actually, in large part, I use a Vedic understanding in the nodes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess in Western astrology, there's a little bit more of a positive orientation towards the North Node and a little bit of skepticism towards the South Node. It's a little bit of inverse. Crazy how we have these inverses between.
But actually, Ernst Wilhelm, the way that he kind of bridges the gap of those two concepts, because he views K2 as kind of a comfort zone. Yeah. So it's not. So it's like the thing you're already pretty good at that's not going to ultimately satisfy you. Yeah. And Rahu is where you have to go for growth, but it's not going to be comfortable.
Yeah, for sure. And that's pretty much how I would describe the nodes.
Yeah.
I would say that magic can unfold in the North Node, but you can also get burned, It's like
like I got burned today, yeah.
Like you got burned today. It's maybe like an unexplored territory that would be exciting to explore, maybe even necessary to explore. I don't think the North Node is, I mean, maybe it depends on people's emphasis and where they are in life or what have you, but I think we have to at least explore the North Node a bit, you know, especially when we're 18, you know, or 37. Yeah. And
are these the years for the transits, for the return?
nodal return. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. 18. It's interesting because Ernst Wilhelm, he also has this yeah, I've just been going through all his courses like a madman kind of, but like he has like 3 courses on Rahu and Ketu actually, but he has a course on the ages of the planets and this idea that certain planets mature at different ages, which comes from some kind of obscure Vedic text that he finds just very, very effective. And basically like Saturn is the last of the 7 traditional planets to mature at age 36 is when you get full access to the power of your Saturn. And
Wow.
then I think it's Rahu at 42 and then Ketu at 48, I believe.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. I like that system. Yeah. Here in the anthroposophical world, there's a sort of biographical map that has to do with the 7 planets. And I can find that interesting to deal with. The moon comes first and Mercury and so forth. Yeah, but integrating also the maturation phase of the planets. I like how there can be maybe an archetypal description of the biography of a human being, as well. Something that happens at different ages of physical development, physical development, but also a sort of unique timeline of different people as well.
It feels like we could go on forever with these, but I'm taking it as an omen the way it's gotten pitch black outside and it was bright when we started. Where you are. and where are you located again? Because you mentioned that the study or I forget the name of the system. It's Rudolf Steiner's thing, right?
Yeah, so I live in Dornach, Switzerland, which is the home of the Goetheanum. I live in I work at the Goetheanum. I run the English edition of their weekly journal. I would have shown you. I was over here for a bit of the first. I was looking at the sunset. I've got a really remarkable sunset view.
Oh wow! You'll have to send me a picture sometime.
Totally. Yeah, and there's a lot of ways that this is a whole other conversation about anthroposophy and astrology and Steiner's take on it. And
anthroposophy is the name of Rudolf Steiner's science that he came up with, or studies of.
Yeah,
like it's like a holistic way for man to live with nature or something like that.
So anthroposophy literally means the wisdom of the human being.
Okay.
And so there was a sort of shift that Steiner redirected this sort of spiritual focus away from sort of what's outside the human being and recognizing that we are, he described it, he said, we are the religion of the gods.
And that's exactly the way I look at astrology. I mean, when I do a meditation on the planets, I'm viewing it as an archetype that is reflected as being attached to this human body, basically.
Mm-hmm.
We are a study of the gods. That's so deep.
The religion of gods, even. Yeah. And so there's some wisdom that's inherent within us that we don't necessarily, there's a big emphasis on this is a huge conversation. We'll have to talk about this some other time.
I was just curious. I just want to let people know like where you're living and what you're doing. And if anybody resonates with your energy and what your style of astrology, the way you've described it, how could they contact you for a reading? Because you give personal readings currently, right?
I do, yeah. So my personal website is astrologyally.com, ALLY. And then also my work with Olivia, you can find at starpoetry.net. Yeah.
Awesome.
I'm
Awesome.
on Instagram. I shit post on Twitter.
What's your Instagram and Twitter name? Is it Charlie Cross or
Charlie on Instagram? It's Charlie Cross with 4 S's, Charlie Cross.
okay.
And I think it's just Charlie Cross on Twitter. So
Okay, cool. Cool. Well,
yeah.
well, I really enjoyed this conversation, Charlie. I'm glad we did it.
Yeah, me too. We'll have to do it again sometime soon.
Definitely. All right.
Yeah.
End the recording.
Okay.